Chapter 28 of Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. This recording by Patty Brugman. Nicholas Nickleby, Chapter 28. Miss Nickleby, rendered desperate by the persecution of Sir Mulberry Hawk, and the complicated difficulties and distresses which surround her, appeals as a last resource to her uncle for protection. The ensuing morning brought reflection with it, as morning usually does, but widely different was the train of thought it awakened in the different persons who had been so unexpectedly brought together on the preceding evening by the active agencies of Messrs. Pyke and Pluck. The reflections of Sir Mulberry Hawk, if such a term can be applied to the thoughts of a systematic and calculating man of dissipation, whose joys, regrets, pains, and pleasures are all of self, and who would seem to retain nothing of the intellectual faculty but the power to debase himself, and to degrade the very nature whose outward semblance he wears. The reflections of Sir Mulberry Hawk turned upon Kate Nickleby, and were, in brief, that she was undoubtedly handsome, that her coyness must be easily conquerable by a man of his address and experience, and that the pursuit was one which could not fail to redound in his credit, and greatly to enhance his reputation with the world. Unless this last consideration, no mean or secondary one with Sir Mulberry, should sound strangely in the ears of some, let it be remembered that most men live in a world of their own, and that in the limited circle alone they are ambitious for distinction and applause. Sir Mulberry's world was peopled with profligates, and he acted accordingly. Thus, cases of injustice and oppression and tyranny and the most extravagant bigotry are in constant occurrence among us every day. It is the custom to trumpet forth much wonder and astonishment at the chief actors therein, setting at defiance so completely the opinion of the world. But there is no greater fallacy. It is precisely because they do consult the opinion of their own little world that such things take place at all, and strike the great world dumb with amazement. The reflections of Mrs. Nickleby were of the proudest and most complacent kind. Under the influence of her very agreeable delusion, she straightway sat down and indited a long letter to Kate, in which she expressed her entire approval of the admirable choice she had made, and extolled Sir Mulberry to the skies, asserting, for the more complete satisfaction of her daughter's feelings, that he was precisely the individual whom she, Mrs. Nickleby, would have chosen for her son-in-law if she had the picking and choosing from all mankind. The good lady then, with the preliminary observation that she might be fairly supposed not to have lived in the world so long without knowing its ways, communicated a great many subtle precepts applicable to the state of courtship, and confirmed in their wisdom by her own personal experience. Above all things, she commended a strict maidenly reserve as being not only a very laudable thing in itself, but as tending materially to strengthen and increase a lover's ardour. And I never, added Mrs. Nickleby, was more delighted in my life than to observe last night, my dear, that your good sense had already told you this. With which sentiment and various hints of the pleasure she derived from the knowledge that her daughter inherited so large an instalment of her own excellent sense and discretion, to nearly the full measure of which she might hope with care to succeed in time, Mrs. Nickleby concluded a very long and rather illegible letter. Poor Kate was well nigh distracted on the receipt of 4 closely written and closely crossed sides of congratulation on the very subject which had prevented her closing her eyes all night, and kept her weeping and watching in her chamber. Still worse and more trying was the necessity of rendering herself agreeable to Mrs. Wycherley, who, being in low spirits after the fatigue of the preceding night, of course expected her companion, else wherefore had she board and salary, to be in the best spirits possible. As to Mr. Wycherley, he went about all day in a tremor of delight at having shaken hands with a lord, and having actually asked him to come and see him in his own house. The lord himself, not being troubled to any inconvenient extent with the power of thinking, regaled himself with the conversation of Messrs. Pyke and Pluck, who sharpened their wit by a plentiful indulgence in various costly stimulants at his expense. It was 4 in the afternoon, that is, the vulgar afternoon of the sun and the clock, and Mrs. Wititterly reclined, according to custom, on the drawing-room sofa, while Kate read aloud a new novel in 3 volumes, entitled The Lady Flabella, which Alphonse the Doubtful had procured from the library that very morning. And it was a production admirably suited to a lady labouring under Mrs. Wititterly's complaint, seeing that there was not a line in it, from beginning to end, which could, by the most remote contingency, awaken the smallest excitement in any person breathing. Kate read on. "Chérissez," said the Lady Flabella, inserting her mouse-like feet in the blue satin slippers which had unwittingly occasioned the half-playful, half-angry altercation between herself and the youthful Colonel Belfiliere in the Duke of Mincefenille's salon de danse on the previous night. "Chérissez, mon cher, donnez-moi de l'eau de Cologne, s'il vous plaît, mon enfant." "Merci, thank you," said the Lady Flabella, as the lively but devoted Chérissez plentifully besprinkled with the fragrant compound the Lady Flabella's mouchoir of the finest cambric, edged with richest lace, and emblazoned at the 4 corners with the Flabella crest, and gorgeous heraldic bearings of that noble family. "Merci, that will do." At that instant, while the Lady Flabella yet inhaled that delicious fragrance by holding the mouchoir to her exquisite but thoughtfully chiselled nose, the door of the boudoir, artfully concealed by rich hangings of silken damask, the hue of Italy's firmament, was thrown open, and with noiseless tread 2 valets de chambre, clad in sumptuous liveries of peach blossom and gold, advanced into the room, followed by a page in bas de soie silk stockings, who, while they remained at some distance making the most graceful obeisance, advanced to the feet of his lovely mistress, and dropping on one knee, presented on a golden salver gorgeously chased a scented billet. The Lady Flabella, with an agitation she could not repress, hastily tore off the envelope, and broke the scented seal. It was Bilfiere, the young, the slim, the low-voiced, her own Bilfiere. "Oh, charming," interrupted Kate's patroness, who was sometimes taken literally. "Poetic, really. Read that description again, Miss Nickleby." Kate complied. "Sweet indeed," said Miss Wititterly with a sigh. "So voluptuous, is it not? So soft." "Yes, I think it is," replied Kate gently. "Very soft." "Close the book, Miss Nickleby," said Miss Wititterly. "I can hear nothing more to-day. I should be sorry to disturb the impression of that sweet description. Close the book." Kate complied, not unwittingly, and as she did so, Mrs. Wititterly, raising her glass with a languid hand, remarked that she looked pale. "It was the fright of that noise and confusion last night," said Kate. "How very odd!" exclaimed Mrs. Wititterly, with a look of surprise. And certainly, when one comes to think of it, it was very odd that anything should have disturbed a companion. A steam engine, or other ingenious piece of mechanism out of order, would have been nothing to it. "How did you come to know Lord Frederick and the other delightful creatures, child?" asked Mrs. Wititterly, still eyeing Kate through her glass. "I met them at my uncle's," said Kate, vexed to feel that she was colouring deeply, but unable to keep down the blood which rushed to her face whenever she thought of that man. "Have you known them long?" "No," rejoined Kate, "not long. I was very glad of the opportunity which that respectable person, your mother, gave us of being known to them," said Mrs. Wititterly in a lofty manner. "Some friends of ours were on the very point of introducing us, which makes it quite remarkable." This was said lest Miss Nickleby should grow conceited on the honour and dignity of having known 4 great people, for Pyke and Pluck were included among the delightful creatures, whom Mrs. Wititterly did not know. But as the circumstance had made no impression one way or the other upon Kate's mind, the force of the observation was quite lost upon her. "They asked permission to call," said Mrs. Wititterly. "I gave it to them, of course." "Do you expect them today?" Kate ventured to inquire. Mrs. Wycherley's answer was lost in the noise of a tremendous rapping at the street door.